You have sat there peacefully and calmly. No one has raised a fist or thrown a raspberry. I guess they're strawberries, don't we? But I know you've been agitated and interested in what's going on. The buzz after yesterday's session was one of the best symptoms we could look for that we are having an engaging conversation and it could make a difference. So my goal is to take as much of the next hour and have you talk to this panel and ask questions. And if someone on this panel doesn't have an answer, there's probably someone in this room. Because from this line right here, I'm not sure where the most distinguished group is. Our audience is very sophisticated on these issues and deeply engaged. So let me take a moment first and ask Abby, if you would, explain what the Chamber, how the Housing Gap Coalition operates, and specifically what is the Chamber doing to try to close this gap?
Thanks, Craig. I appreciate it, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to sit with these for the next hour and answer some of the questions. You heard from Clint Betts earlier today, I think in your opening remarks. He is one of our co-chairs of our Housing Gap Coalition, and he gave you a little bit of an overview of why we started the Housing Gap Coalition in some of his remarks. Saw around, our business leaders started to see around the corner on employees really struggling to find housing, whether it was entering the market, accessing and advancing through the market, whether it was in apartments or condos or single-family homes. And so we commissioned a study with the Kempsey Gardner Institute, and upon the release of that study, launched the GAP Coalition. And as Clint said, Steve Starks is our co-chair with Clint on that. Steve's the president and CEO of the Jazz and Larry H. Miller Corporation. And it's comprised of a number of different business leaders throughout the industry and throughout a broad base of businesses that have concern on this is our biggest economic threat if left unaddressed. As Representative Wilson said in his previous remarks, is we can't continue to put our head in the sand and bury ourselves into not doing something. And we're trying to come together to advance some topics, have conversations with many of the cities. I think about 2/3 of you raised your hand when Clark asked you if you're a city representative, but we've been to 37 cities. Of the 87 we plan on visiting since July. We've presented the data points. We've had dialogue with the cities on what they're doing, what they're putting into place, how they're looking at their general plan and their moderate income housing plan. We are going to be launching a full-blown media campaign. It'll start with social post-election, and then it'll move into January into an education campaign for the general public. Because in a lot of cases, I think as city leaders and as the business community and people that are actually on the front lines of building these homes, we're ahead of the public on this topic. That this is a huge impediment to our continued economic success if we can't get people to find homes, regardless of what type, shape, size, price range. People are struggling with that gap. We have 55,000 unanswered homes in the market right now. We have more household formations than we do household units, and it's a supply and demand issue. And so we're excited to be at the table. I'm excited to answer the questions today, and that kind of gives you a spectrum as to why we're involved. We're the state's business chamber, the largest business association in the state, representing businesses across the state in all 29 counties. So we have an absolute interest in the economic success of the state, and certainly this is the component right now.
Thank you. All right, please wait for the microphone to come to you, but who has the thought they'd like to share, a response, a rebuttal, or a question?
We were looking at days on market statistics a little bit ago, and one thing that we learned is it looks like the biggest glut of inventory that we have is about the $300,000 to $400,000 price range. We have maybe 6.5, 7 months of inventory in that range as opposed to other price ranges. And it looks to me like about 80% of the new construction inventory that's coming online, that's being built right now, is in that same price range. And so I worry a little bit about what that will do to supply and demand and what that will do with new construction, because we have so much inventory in there, in that area. Can you guys just, Brad and Clark, just comment on that and why that is? Is that the new starter home price range in Utah? And so that's about as low as we're going to see for single family detached housing. Is that the highest level of profitability for you guys? Is that all cities will allow you to build? Just kind of comment on why that is and what you see happening there a little bit.
Brad can take the most of this, but I think the toughest thing is that builders are having a hard time finding lots that they can get homes built on for under $300,000. So they are trying to hit the affordability quotient, but it's difficult because of the starting place. And so I think they are building a lot in that area. And I am a little bit concerned too that builders, like all of us, can be we can be lemmings at time and all follow the same track. And truthfully, $400,000 is a great price point in some markets. It's very low and very compelling and competes with the existing stock of housing. In other markets, you have to be $250 to be super competitive. So it is a little bit different from market to market, from county to county. And so we study each market individually. And as an example, in Salt Lake County, we know we have to be, well, in Utah County and in Davis and Weber County, we're typically targeting a starting price point that's $50,000 less than Salt Lake County, just as an example.
I'm not sure I have a lot to add. Clark articulated my thoughts pretty well. I'll just maybe add one additional thought. I think that it's going to almost be impossible here in the near future to deliver a product under $400,000. I mean, just given where costs are going with not just land, and not just impact fees, Dave, so just relax. But with just our cost structures in general. In fact, we're having a really hard time delivering homes in that price range. But I think there's probably something else going on, Mike. I think that I alluded to it when I was talking earlier, but I just think we're getting to a place where this first-time buyer can't afford to move into the market. And that's why we're not seeing a lot of these numbers move. And so, especially if they want to move into new construction. And so, I'm not just a little, I'm really worried we're going to get constipated here pretty quick, and people aren't going to be able to start buying new homes at the entry-level prices and start to move up. I think we're already starting to see some of that in terms of where markets are getting a little soft. So,
I'll just add one thing on that. 85% of all of our homes sold are to second, third, fourth, and beyond home buyers. They're not first-time home buyers, and you're seeing very few solutions, just like Brad said, that are giving opportunities to the first-time home buyer. And the other big problem with this that Chris Nelson touched on earlier, he asked the question about the condo and townhome market. The truth is, a lot of investors are snatching up a lot of that demand. And some of these projects that were intended to be sold to individual homeowners are being kept by large groups, or in some cases single developers that retain either a condo project or a townhome project and lease it out. We've done that in some cases. We don't like to mix for rent and for sale in the same neighborhood. We rarely do that, but we sometimes designate an entire subdivision or phase of townhomes that are going to be for sale eventually to an investor, but we typically retain those for a year, rent them, with the idea of experiencing a capital gain instead of ordinary income. But it's just something that the condo financing is out there, but the investor is more nimble, can get the housing more quickly. Oftentimes, the realtor commissions are smaller. There's a lot of efficiencies in that. And so I think it's going to be a part of the future, condos and townhomes. But right now, it really hasn't provided a lot of the answer because investors are getting a good portion of those.
I want to personalize this because I like your question, Mike. My middle son, 26 years old, out of college 1 year, works for Domo, makes a great starting salary. Couldn't be more proud of him. He bought his first home and moved in on Monday. $339,000 for a townhome in Draper. I won't tell you what I was going to say. He thinks he's a homeowner, okay? Well, guess who gave him 20% to get into that house? Okay? And I'm lucky and blessed enough that I could. I feel guilty sitting up here because most people in Utah can't do that. And that's the problem we're having. He thinks he's got equity. No, I own your equity, buddy. You know, okay? And we have got to address that. I think Brad hit it on the head. We can't push seniors aging out of their housing out of our communities. We can't, you know, with restrictive zoning, say one size fits all. It has to take a mix, and we all have to do part of that. Because my son and I have had many arguments over the past couple weeks about what homeownership is and what it isn't. And he's just lucky. That's all I can say.
So for me, housing costs are primarily of interest in relation to wages and purchasing power or renting power. And so while wages are staying relatively flat or not increasing that much for the majority of residents, and what we're hearing is that developers and cities only have so much control over costs, what do you think the development community's role is in bringing wages more into balance with costs?
The Gardner Institute actually put out a report, I think it's been like 6 months ago, but wages are actually up 5%. It's one of the highest in the nation, actually, in this region. And so wages are starting to go up. They are rising. I mean, we're at a 2.9% unemployment rate. The number one issue for business leaders right now is not that I can find skilled workers. I just want to find a warm body. And so absolutely wages are starting to increase. You know, it's not a leading indicator, it's a reactionary, and so they're absolutely on the rise.
Thank you. What is the state doing to bring economic development, say, to South Utah County, where there's still less expensive land, lots of land that could be developed, and the cost of that land would be less expensive, but that without the economic development, without lots of jobs down there, people are not going to want to make the long commute up to where the jobs are.
And by the way, that long commute means more air pollution.
Well, Abby and I were just in a meeting this morning about this very issue, and we have been operating under an economic development strategy in the state that's worked really well, extremely well. We've gone from having probably the least, if not the second or third least diverse economy in the country 30 years ago to today. We have the most diverse economy in the country, which is great for us. But the challenge is we've grown significantly, and we've got to start managing that growth differently. And part of what that looks like is the state, in combination with local government, has got to think about how do we start creating regional job centers outside the usual suspects. When you've got 50% of the growth in the state of Utah occurring in a 35-mile swath of land, it's not really a sustainable trajectory to be on. So your point's a valid one. In fact, we actually talked about Utah County this morning. There are other constraints, though. One that came up this morning is water. And so this is not a simple turn one dial and everything's going to get better differently. It's a kind of complex, interwoven mesh that we've got to figure out and work on together. And so we're getting to a point here pretty close where the state's just going to have to start bringing stakeholders together in probably a different way to talk about how we continue to grow the economy, because, and we all know this, but most of the growth we have here is not folks moving in from out of state. We have a fair amount of that, more now than we've had in a long time, but it's still just our kids. And so we complain a lot about the growth, but we all want our kids to be close by. And so we're going to have to figure out a different way to grow so they can still be. And your point about creating economic hubs other places is absolutely part of the solution.
For that area, it's the point of the mountain.
Just one additional comment on that. I still think that, our priority needs to be first on the infill development before we go to the outer edges, even though it's important for us to do planning now to make sure that eventually we have the right infrastructure and roadways there, particularly setting aside right-of-ways, which we could have done much better, 10 and 20 years ago. It would have saved us a fortune as a state, but if we could do that now, it'd be fantastic. But think of the advantages of developing in the existing neighborhoods right now where schools are losing their, school-age population, and they are going to be shutting down. Why wouldn't we want to do redevelopments there where we didn't have to build new schools, where the sewer and the water and the utilities are all readily available and perhaps underutilized? So that's a big focus, and we for a long time have focused on infill development, and we will continue to, but it is getting more and more difficult, both because the land is more scarce and because the NIMBYism, the surrounding neighbors, are more and more, difficult to get things done with. So it is still, I think, worth battling, and we have to do it because it will produce the absolute best economic returns for the state, while at the same time planning for these other hubs that are on the outskirts.
I represent two cities, one that's built out basically and one that's got a lot of undeveloped property. And I understand the problem, I think I understand the problem, but what as cities can we do? I mean, I'm kind of stuck. What specifically do I do? We haven't redone our impact fees like Farmington has for quite some time. They need to be redone, and now they sound like they're the evil thing to do. I'm stuck. What's your suggestions?
No, I don't want to answer that. But it's a good question, John. I think there is a place for statewide oversight. Some of my compadres wouldn't share that view, okay? I think we have to be careful overreacting to that. I alluded to the referendum problem in my comments. And, John, I was out in Harriman at my grandson's football game the other day, and having built out there many years ago, it blew my mind just in a few years how much that community's blossomed. I think we have to look at the small things in an incremental manner. I think there's got to be a huge amount of public education. I think there's got to be updates to our general plan. Some communities are balancing their housing stock. We've got to bite the bullet and talk about what that balanced housing stock looks like, and we've got to go through the painful transparency public process. The developers need to be in the room when that happens, because every elected official will be thrown out of office if they're left to stand there alone. In my personal experience, and you know this, I've sued a city. That bald-headed guy sitting on the back row represented me. He did a good job, okay? Sorry, Bruce. That city, yeah, there's a lot of bald heads in the room. That city refused to follow their own planning documents and their own rules to the point where we were left with no choice. It was a terrible choice for the developer to be in that position. So I think we have to push our elected officials at the local level to educate smart people. I think we have to shield our planning commissions so they can make the hard decisions without the political fallout that sometimes comes. I think we have to look at revisiting our general plans. I think we have to talk about transit more at a regional level than we're doing it now. We can't pave our way out of this problem. It's just going to create sprawl.
Chris has seen this in a lot of different places around the country.
And here. When I was here, I had my students, my research associates, collect data from Salt Lake County, all the cities, all the parcels, And we created a map. We used built a model that depreciated the non-residential properties by location. And what we found by color coding the map, we found that roughly a third of all non-residential parcels in Salt Lake County had an FAR of less than 0.2, meaning the FAR, floor area ratio, is the ratio of the building space to the land area. A 0.2 FAR means 80% of the land is basically parking lot. And so a third of the properties were very low FAR and beyond their useful life. They're low-hanging fruit for redevelopment. And we tried to communicate this method to planners across the valley. And I'll take the blame. I wasn't successful enough to impart the implications of this approach. But for example, in cities that would say they're built out, they're not built out. They are underdeveloped. They have, in many cases, they have a quarter to a third of their existing land base that is underutilized using current market dynamics. So there's a lot of opportunity, as Clark alluded to earlier, for infill and redevelopment of these aging, low FAR, low-hanging fruit properties, if we only had a strategy to do so. And that strategy starts with mapping the opportunities, laying out the opportunities, and figuring out the strategies to leverage private sector investment, and maybe there's some public sector participation as well. So I think of all parts in the country, this is a place where this can be done very successfully. Now, NIMBYs get in the way, less so here, oddly, than other places. California is the NIMBYest state in the union. And you can see what's happened to California. And it's gotten so bad that California has been forced to basically take control away from local governments to overcome NIMBYism. I think there are better ways to overcome NIMBYism, partly by having a conversation with the neighborhoods. And in that regard, when I was working here at the university, I would have meetings with groups around the Salt Lake City area, and they were concerned about the rail stations and development around the rail stations. And I said, no, wait a minute. Better to have high-density development down the street under the tree canopy that you can't even see than have that same development encroach in your neighborhood, because the market's going to have to go somewhere. Put the market demand where the market demand is better suited. So these are the kind of, and they bought that. They understood that. So we need to come up with an overall strategy, mapping, the data analysis, the looking at demographic trends. This is not difficult to do. We need to do this. A couple of other comments. I think Dave mentioned earlier the problem with accessory dwelling units. You add more units and you compromise the water sewer. In my own work, I found that with declining household sizes, you're actually unleashing more capacity in your existing water and sewer lines. In a sense, you had better add more residential units to the existing neighborhoods to utilize the capacity you've already built and paid for. So there's a strong argument, I think, for either adding more ADUs or adding or densifying existing neighborhoods to some extent within the limits of their water and sewer systems. I've got other comments, but I'll raise those later when the time arises.
Does the panel have any suggestions how we as a group can work with HUD to get the FHA product back to a reasonable monthly mortgage insurance that goes away within 5 or 10 years, and or at 20% or 25% equity, so that Dave doesn't have to give 20% to his son, he could give 3.5%, and we could make that a viable, I'm sorry? I didn't want to give him any. Well, and we could make that a viable starter home program like it's always been since its inception.
I don't think we can do much in Utah with FHA. We do see some flexibility there just in the last few years. They're starting to see more, they're more confident right now in the lending world, and there's not as big a reaction as there needed to be in the past for some of the loose standards. So we are seeing sort of a moderating of some of those tight standards. I think there is a lot we could do with like the Utah Housing Corporation and what we could do in partnering, having them partner with municipalities in providing down payment assistance, in doing some things that would help first-time home buyers. Those kind of programs that we're involved with are tremendously successful. We have one that we're doing right now with Park City that's on the affordable side. And really, it's sort of like we give 95%, they give 5%. But there's a lot of situations where we could partner, collaborate, developer, city, come up with solutions for workforce housing, first-time home buyers that would be terrific. And I think any city that's progressive enough to look at that ought to be talking with Brad Wilson and others in leadership, because there is a real opportunity to create, I think, first-time home buyer programs that would be significantly important to helping this in the future.
I'm going to add one thing that's not an answer to your question, but I think it's a secondary answer to your question. We have to synchronize our public dollars and our public policy. And I'm not talking about HUD. Pluralsight's a great example, okay? We have Pluralsight in Farmington, who's one of these unicorns, great company, growing crazy, great jobs, blah, blah, blah. They're moving to Silicon Slopes in the Lehigh area. I think it's Draper. They're actually building their campus. And they're still up there. We should not have given state training credits for one company to move from Utah, one Utah location to another Utah location. Farmington's going to be just fine because we're going to backfill that and there's people standing in line. But I think we should, with transportation dollars, with GoEd funds, with state training funds, synchronize. And I know there was an attempt in Schultz's bill to do that. I don't think we've seen the language yet of how that's actually going to work. But I think we have to synchronize our public dollars, which are, you know, sacred dollars, and use those and reward cities that are doing the balanced housing, that are doing the TOD, that are doing the mix of housing stock. I think then you can create that carrot that a city can say, hey, there's a couple $1 million I can get over here to help me if I could, you know, you got to give the politicians something to work with. So.
I don't even remember the last question, but I'm going to go back to the one before. Yours was about FHA, and it would be nice if we could figure that out. Clark knows all those people. He used to be the federal one of them, so let's have him fix it. But I don't even know what he just sent my direction, by the way. I wasn't listening, and he just said, talk to me about something, so we'll figure out what that looks like later. But I want to go back to the question about this gentleman that represents two cities, one that's fully built out and one that's got a lot of runway in front of it, because I'm not sure we completely addressed your question, and it's a super complex question, obviously. But first of all, I want to completely agree with what Clark said about infill, and that is, for a lot of reasons, including the investment in infrastructure, whether it's education infrastructure or roads or other infrastructure, the right thing to do. And you look at some of these cities, on the Wasatch Front in particular, that have figured that out, and they are so cool. And they are turning into some of the most vibrant, amazing neighborhoods you'd see anywhere in the world. And so it's really amazing to see the cities that have embraced that and are doing infill and are really thoughtful but creative and really open to new ideas. So hopefully that's part of the mix. As we move forward, though, there's no way that as a state we can accomplish what I think we collectively want to, which is continue to grow, have places for our kids to work and live, without everybody thinking about kind of their general plans in their cities. How do they need to look different? How can we be creative and open to new ideas? And do what Dave talked about at the same time, revisit those in a way where we bring everybody along. Because there's an educational process that people need to go through. And sometimes it just takes time for that process to work itself out and people get the bigger picture. I have as a developer, and I know these guys up here have as well, the biggest mistakes that we make at times is when we try to move too fast in a city and don't bring people along with us. Now, there are times, even if you give it your best effort, you can't succeed. But more often than not, if you give it a good try, you end up with something that works a little bit better. But the cities and local government, I think, have a role in that process to take people through kind of a different process that way. If you look at, and I alluded to this earlier, but if you look at Senate Bill 35 in California, which you talked about a minute ago, one of the things that the state basically took away control from local government on is, I mean, they did a lot of things, but one of the things they have started to just require is that cities move faster, a lot faster. And that absolutely positively is within the control of the cities here and your elected officials to change your processes so you can move faster. And the reason that matters is it's very expensive to sit on ground or to go through an expensive entitlement process. And the amount of money that that adds to the process and the cost of a home, we think doesn't make a lot of difference, but it really does. And that's a really easy thing for state government to come in and do, is mandate a process, but the state doesn't necessarily want to do that. But if I were to pick some low-hanging fruit for everyone in here, that would be something everyone could go back, work with your local elected officials and figure that out. So anyway, thanks.
Let me just add my 2 cents. One of the things we have is existing housing stock in existing neighborhoods. And we have got to preserve it, enhance it, and make it good quality family place to the extent we can. And I'm going to be talking out of both sides of my mouth on this. When I was on the Provo City Council 35 years ago, we right zoned downtown neighborhoods, and they are thriving, in my opinion. Ernest Wilkinson suggested we build apartments for the expansive BYU expansion in 1950s. And so they zoned the whole downtown for, something like 10 units to the acre or more, 20 units to the acre. We changed it to the zoning that's there. We made the existing housing legal, stabilized it, beat up the lenders so they'd make loans there, and provided some modest incentives. Preserving existing housing stock has got to count for a lot. Mr. Grove.
Craig, let me add one thing to that. And as we're visiting these cities, I'm going to give you is anyone here from Mill Creek? Okay, that's your existing city. So you just went through a new general plan update with local, it was about a year ago, right after you became a city, with the local, new established local government, with community councils, with the legislators that represent that community. And they were going to rezone, their first rendition was going to rezone like 20 different areas. And then they looked at where can we actually specify based on the transportation, the high density transportation routes, where we can rezone and look at redevelopment. What's the second life of this neighborhood gonna look like? And so they took a specific area, and it was well received by the community. They're under development right now to do some new things along, I think it's 2900 South or 3900 South. They went through the TLC program with the Wasatch Front Regional Council, and MAG has that too, Mountain Land Association has that too. So there's communities that are doing it and doing it really well. And then to Dave's point, there's communities that are not, just refusing to go through a robust general plan update and take the time and the effort to really envision what the future looks like and what their role is as local government to fit into this whole scheme of population growth. Instead of just, again, back to my original point, putting their head in the sand and putting up the moat and saying, nope, we don't want any more. Every city has to do this in their own way, in their own fashion, but everybody's got to be a part of this solution.
Yeah, I'd like to mention 2 things. One is, first, just reflecting on the older housing stock. Salt Lake City has about 40,000 single-family housing units. I would guess about 20,000 of those are much older. They're unreinforced masonry, so they're hazards in an earthquake. They're old styles. You saw the Hearst scores that Clark put up in terms of their impact on energy, but more importantly, their impact on air pollution. This is an opportunity, I think, where all of us need to look at this older housing stock because we cannot stay in compliance with air quality standards without fixing those old houses, because that's where many of our monitors are. The monitor that's particularly the biggest problem is right in the middle of a very older neighborhood, depressed neighborhood. So just I'd like to throw that out. The second is, and I asked this question yesterday, and I want to ask it again to this panel. We have probably 100 major intersections in the Salt Lake Valley, arterial intersections which have old shopping centers. Probably half of the big box stores are going to go away. They are challenged because of a fragmentation of title, leases that don't end at the same time, all sorts of complexities where governments have powers to help. And the question is, we used to have commercial zones that allowed housing as a permitted use in the commercial zone. We've changed many of our zones to update them so that they no longer allow housing. Is there some way to facilitate with a partnership between the landowners, the state, the cities, the developers, to facilitate a much faster shift that our distinguished professor has reminded us of back, to get a lot more housing in this valley? So that's my question. How do you facilitate that market trend that's struggling right now with the big box stores to turn that into effective reuse in housing?
The easiest way would be to redistribute sales tax based upon head count and not point of sale. I mean, that's the most obvious way. And then all of a sudden, cities understand that if they bring in that additional housing, they're going to get that share, and they won't hold on so tightly to defunct, developments that are no longer in the Amazon era, viable. I think if you have 4 commercial corners, you probably, in most of these circumstances you're talking about, only one should really be retail and commercial, and the other 3 should be housing, and then that one would prosper. And so I think the legislature, that would be a bold move, and we have great leadership coming, and that would be an amazing thing to see transition over time that would bring a change of mindset where municipalities then would be focused more on attracting people than attracting retailers who may not be there permanently.
He might be right, but I can't let that one go unanswered. The cities will resist any changes to the sales tax formula that doesn't have some safe harbor provisions and such, because cities like mine, we were an importer of sales tax forever. Now we're an exporter. We've worked our whole economic development plan around the rules and are planning around the rules. And if we suddenly change the rules without some kind of preserve and protect clause, that could backfire politically. I also think, to that question, cities need to have the courage to downzone property and or look at mixed use in their commercial zones where it makes sense. We got to get back to the live, work, play. We got to stop falling in love with our cars, and we got to get people walking again. My city's made a huge commitment to trails. If I were to take away trails, geez, I'd be lynched. But I think we have to create more walkable communities, bring the jobs closer to the homes. And you can do that with infill. You can do that with mixed use, properly done, carefully planned.
So the sales tax issue is a nuance I hadn't thought about. It's the usual case in my experience around the country that most cities over-zone land for commercial relative to demand. If you zone it, they will come. Well, they don't come. So by oversupplying land for commercial and not allowing alternative uses, you reduce property value. It's not generating money, and so reduced property value means reduced property tax revenues. Spokane, some years ago, Washington, did an inventory of their commercial properties along a couple of major corridors and realized they were like 15, 20 times more or so oversupplied with commercial. So they right-sized the commercial zoning relative to demand and changed the zoning to allow more housing along these corridors. And last I checked, this major corridor is getting a lot more housing. And of course, the housing generates the business for the commercial, kind of odd how that works. So now you have the right sizing commercial, now you have vibrant commercial, and now you're developing housing on property that otherwise was underutilized because of the zoning. And the city's generating more property tax revenues and sales tax revenues too in this case. So I think there's a lot to be said for taking a hard market assessment of your city. How many square feet of commercial does the market really support now or in 15 years? And be honest about that. And then change the surplus land from commercial to residential. That demand is there. It may look crummy along commercial corridors, but that demand is there when you do the design right.
I think there's a lot to be said for planning, and there are some cities, as we've heard from Abby's reports as she goes out to these 37 cities, some are really engaged in the planning process and are thinking about the future and are having those discussions. And it is those same cities that are solving problems in advance and I think going to be in great standing. There are others that have not updated their moderate housing plan or sort of looked really seriously at their commercial planning based upon the new world that we live in, and they will pay a big price. And so you, as folks at the cities, attorneys, planners, can have a huge impact if you can motivate your councils and mayors to spend more time thinking in a futuristic way. And then I agree with what Dave said earlier, collaborating with developers in the room so that we're coming up with solutions that make sense and will work.
How do we deal with the situations where we have a disparity in revenues when the city does something on an administrative basis literally without any basis? And we've had city council members say, I know I have no basis. Ooh, pardon me, that's telling me to get up and work out. Let me shut it off. That says it's noon, by the way. So how do we deal with the fact that sometimes cities actually say, I know I have no legal basis for turning this down, but I'm going to turn it down anyway. And under the Governmental Immunity Act, we have absolutely no recourse for the developer at all, because the best they're going to get is what you're entitled to. You don't get attorney's fees, you don't get delay damages. They can hold stuff up for 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, or you get wacko third-party challenges. I had one where somebody was claiming that the fish in the Daybreak Lake, where it was a violation of the Endangered Species Act. There's no ability to move forward. There's a disparate remedy. How do we solve that problem? Because I think that would free up an awful lot of, yeah, Brad, this one's for you. How do we solve that disparate remedy issue?
Bruce. So good to see you. Well, I would just tell people to hire you. I mean, I think that there are some things you brought up that probably could be discussed in terms of a solution to this issue. Not all of them. I mean, that was a long list of remedies that you kind of laid out there. But we do need to find a way, kind of like what I talked about earlier, to be able to make the right decisions and make them quicker. And part of what, I mean, I don't want to keep bringing this up, but part of what you just described is, I think, and I'm not saying we should follow California's model, but part of the reason California ended up wading into this space and taking a lot of this over at a state level. And so we maybe need to look at some of those solutions you described and evaluate the pros and cons of each and try to find a way to make some things happen differently. But, you know, I think that if I can just, we're about out of time, this might be my last chance to say something. And I'll just say this. At the state level, we've had a tremendous amount of success over the last few decades of solving some pretty complicated problems. And one of the mantras that we have, at least in the House, and I think the Senate feels this way also, sometimes it's really hard to know what the Senate thinks. I mean, let's just be honest. But in the House is that no is not an answer. No is not a solution. It's not an option. We've got to find a way to fix big problems. And so people either can come together and we'll try to find a solution to a problem together, or in rare cases, I don't know how raw I should be, but like in the example of Leland-Lamport, the legislature will just do it. And so, but that's not the preferred path that we try to go down. And because we always get better outcomes if we can get everyone around the table and try to find solutions to that. Whether it's, I see my friend John Butler, whether it's getting rid of the Zion Curtain a few years ago, or building an inland port, or moving the state prison, or hard things. And by the way, the hardest of those was the Zion Curtain, I'll just tell you right now. We can get a lot more done if we work together, so.
I've been so negative today that I want to end positive, and it's probably my last comment also. I think, okay, well, most of the cities, Bruce, I don't like your question, okay? And I don't like, I am being positive. That's the truth. Someone look up John 8:32, okay? Know the truth and it shall set you free, okay? I have two thoughts on that. First off, a lot of people are trying to do it right, and we need to be positive of that. We make these stories sometimes about the outlier cities bigger than they are. Having said that, and those that know me know I'm a little more draconian in some ways, I did not like suing a city. I really didn't. But when that city doesn't follow its own rules, even after court orders, sometimes the developer's left with no recourse. When those things happen, we need to make public examples out of the people that put them in those equations. Not because it's a get-even equation, okay? But because the only way you're going to get the elected officials in the aggregate, in these outliers, to change is by letting them see and feel the consequences of the poor decisions at the ballot box. And so we have to not be afraid to call those out. If the city sees, and we try to do this, I know the league tries to do this all the time. If there's a city pushing the envelope, we try to call them on that and say, get your act together. Some listen, some don't, okay? The other thing is we have to collaborate. Having been a developer, I can tell you there were many things I did for cities that were illegal or distasteful. But time is money. And I'll bite the bullet sometimes with that planner at the counter because I have to get that entitlement done and time is money, okay? And the problem that creates, and developers do this, they sometimes pay more than they should. The problem is that enables that planner or that council or that planning commissioner to think that was legal or appropriate. We need to make sure we're careful as city officials with what the law allows us to do, what exactions allow us to do, and what we should do. And we have to balance that. And it really does take both of us working on the same side of that, or we will have the horror stories occasionally crop up that you really don't have any other recourse sometimes but to call them out on it. I apologize. I don't think that was as positive as I intended it to be. Okay. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Dave.
I had a question. Several months ago, our building secretary, she would change jobs, employers. She works for West Valley. I work for Farmington City, and she worked for West Valley City, and great person. I saw she's now building secretary for West Valley, and I saw her at a workshop, and we said hello to each other. And what she said to me, I wasn't asking for it. It totally surprised me. She said, I said, how's it going in West Valley City? And he said, you know, the rank and file property owner is much less demanding than the rank and file property owner in Farmington. And so my question is is there a correlation with NIMBYism as is related to income in your experience? Yes. And the other second question, what about this house flipping craze? Is that significant or not? Thank you.
Okay, I'll just answer the NIMBYism question, and you can do the house flipping, Clark. So last month, in partnership with the League and a couple counties in the Wasatch Front Regional Council, we commissioned a survey that I know many of you, if you went to the League's annual meeting, heard about. But 2,500 people across 7 counties, specifically in some high growth areas. And I was appalled to live here when I read some of the results. People are very, very pretentious. And it's acutely, it's acute in some of the more high wage areas. But NIMBYism is felt everywhere. And there's a definite, they don't understand what the cities and the developers are trying to do, and they feel like they don't have a say in it. And the data is informing the way we're going to run this media campaign and how we're going to get into the hearts and minds of people. But it was very, very concerning to me as a citizen living here. And I'm not from here. I've been here 18 years, and chose to raise my family here. But you know, it's crazy what people are feeling it, but they're feeling it everywhere. And it's not just about housing, it's about growth. And they feel like it's out of their control. Now, we've got to figure out this referendum thing. It's a huge deal. You can go through all the due diligence, through the legislative process, through the developer having hundreds and hundreds of open meetings and processes, and the city council and the planning commission going through their process. And at the end of the day, a group of citizens can get enough signatures and stop a development. And to Dave's point, time is money. And we've got to figure out the best course of educating the general public, but then also allowing, and I don't know what the silver bullet here is, but the referendum law right now is out of whack. And we've got to figure it out, because people don't take the time and the effort to understand what's happening on some of these developments. And it doesn't have to be a development. It could be as easy as a light plant that they don't like. And they can raise signatures and they can start a Rocky Mountain power plant or light plant from going in. So we've got to figure out that component to it. But yes, NIMBYism is alive and well.
And stronger in wealthier cities.
More affluent neighborhoods are more likely to pay signature gatherers in the referendum process, and we've seen that. You know, it's not just affluent areas, though. West Valley City, you were just talking about, used to be one of our favorite places to build. And we don't do anything there now. And the reason that your former employee is really happy is she doesn't have much to do, because no one's building much in West Valley City. And the reason is because they have now, gone from one extreme to another. And to build in West Valley City, you're required to do full masonry. I'm talking about brick homes on 4 sides that are a minimum of 2,000 square feet on a rambler. And you're having an average lot size of 15,000 square feet plus. And so we found several parcels recently, but in looking to change or see if there was any flexibility, there wasn't any. So I think a big key to this, and the reason I bring this up, is moderation, not quickly going. I agree it would displace a lot of cities if too quickly we changed the way sales taxes were calculated, but why not do something that phases in over a 10-year period of time or 15-year period of time, so that it changes people's focus, but it doesn't hurt them immediately? And why don't we, be careful as cities to just make more moderate and incremental changes that will have, an end result that we can all sort of target and be happy about. I think there's a lot to be said for we as cities and developers working together in a collaborative fashion and doing things in an incremental fashion to make changes over time.
I'd like to put a pitch in for some regional collaboration. Dr. Nelson talked about Oregon. I happen to work there for a number of years myself. And is there a role for some statewide planning goals that will give city council members some protection for the fact that they have to deal with certain planning goals or certain standards that we all should be taking a look at? In particular, the one that he referenced earlier was the shared housing requirements.
I grew up in Oregon, and I actually was part of that process. My PhD is on the Oregon planning process. There's a lot to be said for that process, a lot not to be said for that process, of course. The couple things that I think are really interesting about what Oregon did is they bit the bullet. They required every city, including Wagon Tire, Oregon, population 40, to identify its long-term housing needs, identify them, and then meet those needs, surprise, surprise, and they had to zone the property today to meet the future housing needs, which undercuts the need to go through continuous zone changes in the future to meet the emerging needs then. So I thought that was a pretty efficient approach. And then Oregon required selected regions, Eugene, Portland, I think Salem, to, through the regional planning process, require everybody to come to the same table, look at the same numbers, population, housing demand, jobs, everything else, and basically haggle among themselves to allocate fairly who gets what, and they horse trade. They literally horse trade. I've seen it. They horse trade. So you have the staff generate the numbers, and the cities can just dispute the numbers, and some do, and they're successful. But the bottom line is that when the long-term numbers are settled, then they haggle, and then they negotiate, and they codify the agreements. That's a novel idea, to agree on something, and that's done at the regional level. But there are some other procedural things that they do. In Oregon, a developer is entitled to a decision on a land use proposal within 4 months. If the local government fails to make a decision in 4 months, a writ of mandamus is issued to compel the local government to issue the permit. And I've seen that happen. Then if there is an appeal after 4 months, that appeal goes to the State Land Use Board of Appeals, LUBA. And they have to decide within 4 months. And then that appeal can go to the State Court of Appeal, and they have to decide within 4 months. In other words, in a year in Oregon, you are theoretically in and out of the process. And the state uses clear and objective standards. You make decisions based on what's already written in the rules, and you can't change the rules. And so developers know there's a checklist. You check the boxes, you do these things, and you meet the requirements for development. And that undercuts NIMBYism. Doesn't eliminate it, but it undercuts a large share of the NIMBYism. So I think there's a lot of lessons that could be looked at from Oregon and applied selectively. Those that work are applicable here, of course. There are other examples out of Florida and a few other places as well. So I think that one thing maybe the academics could do here, or maybe the Gardner Institute, is to do a scan, national scan, to see what other states do that work or don't work, and inform legislators on what might be possible here as a collective decision-making process.
It's 12.
It is 12. And that's long enough. So thank you to our panel. Congratulations. The next session after lunch, well, the next session will be our lunch session. We have a couple of very extraordinarily professional and successful attorneys who will comment on just the day-to-day grind and how we're to deal with it professionally and ethically. Then we'll have a panel on housing solutions, distinguished group led by Nicole Cottle, who will have a chance for rebuttal at that point for everyone in this room. The next session after that will be referenda and initiative, the nuts and bolts. What is exactly the rule? How is it evolving? What's going on at the court right now? The Supreme Court is in chambers discussing a referendum case. And at that same time, across the hall, there'll be our stormwater discussion. That'll be the 2:40 hour. Then the last hour, we'll be here together, talk about changes in the land use law, and wrap up the program at that time. These are your sandwich choices, just in case you don't have to look at every table. You may have a turkey sandwich, a club sandwich, a tomato bacon, a turkey bacon sandwich, roast beef, ham, or veggie. Or if you'd prefer a salad, we have both chef salads and Santa Fe chicken salads. So please grab your lunch, come back here, and we'll start.